Okay, well, we are welcoming everyone to our last session where we have primarily review of any and everything covered in the course, questions specifically for the exam, but more generally where and why the ideas fit together, or any exam specifics, which Alan and Brandon and Jim have been actively answering generally. Third, we've got sort of follow-ups on any open-ended themes, such as especially the discussions with China, about China compared internationally. And then let me just frame it with one interesting comment, which was more my reaction, which is, I only learned, I will be frank, that Alan was teaching this course to the Chinese students in the last few years. And so he has learned, he's not only a PhD candidate in sociology, he's taken courses in medieval Islam and Genghis Khan, and how these massive transformations militarily, culturally, religiously, transformed India, the united India and, Russia, China, and areas down to Iraq and Iran, as well as with Mongolia and more, and persist in various complicated ways. He pointed out that, as I talked about themes in Wagner, and I gave you bits on that. He then pointed out that he was teaching the course afterward, and he presented some of that here. What I did not say, and what I guess he said implicitly, was that most of what Richard Wagner had to say was taken mostly from what he reviewed as part of Romantic nationalism. So Wagner did not add very much to that. He added the music, he added the works, but his theories were primarily things which were already developed by the others. And the linkage with the Brothers Grimm was also very specific and useful. We then talked afterward, and he made one more very interesting point, which is, we have not mentioned explicitly the Italian Renaissance. And he with his centuries old Chinese eye, saw this as the beginning innovation of the West, especially involving the arts. The arts was bound up with the entire emergence of the West from, that is, of the West the West was nothing until after the Renaissance, but I shouldn't say nothing. It was important in the Mediterranean with the Roman Empire. But after the Roman Empire, the so-called Middle Ages came along, and then after that came the Renaissance. And the Renaissance was marked by trade internationally, globally, with areas as far away as China, but it also was marked for many others by the paintings, the frescoes, the architecture, especially commissioned by and surrounding the churches of the Roman Catholic Church. And thus it was an artistic place-making activity. Another one more visibly in the North was then later, well, from the Middle Ages it really began and continued on, was Notre Dame in Paris, which had the problems more recently. But the simple point is, from an outsider, non-European eye, the European, one major contribution was the Italian Renaissance, and the end, in a sense, was 19th century Romantic nationalism. That's a very nice, in a sense, labeling and also implicit suggestion that the Europeans have stopped being very innovative since the 19th century. And I've sometimes talked about Europe as the past, the US is active now, Asia is the future. And he didn't say that, but I'm saying it because many other people in Asia are increasingly saying this. And that's part of the rationale for comparing all three in different ways, not just those areas descriptively, but the ideas behind them. And so to see then in the work today with Qi, with the scenes activities explicitly recognized as central in what's called cultural policy making, much more actively used, articulated, and being developed not only by academics, but very high-level policymakers in Beijing, across China, is exciting to see how these ideas involving the arts have played an important role from the Italian Renaissance in the present with popular culture and more from Hollywood, and then in the future with all kinds of things going on in Asia. So we can compare these as even if some of the countries or the people die off, much of the artwork, much of the literature, many of the films can still be retrieved, experienced, looked at, and compared, and then discussed in terms of how did they define the place, and more. Okay, so if that's a broad, that's really not an analytical background so much as an historic background, but I think it's a useful, interesting, salutary reminder of placing, and we've used place in multiple ways in the course, obviously and explicitly. In this way, I'm using it in the most general way, and to talk of Asia and China, North America, and then Europe, as well as going down to one street, as we've done in the case of Theaster Gates, or one artwork. I'll just mention one with it. Theaster Gates was in Time magazine a few months ago. He led a meeting of African-American artists, which I'll mention just to contrast with it, to make the point that there are many, many types of themes and cultural orientations, perspectives, ideologically, theologically, emotionally, among African Americans in the US. And Theaster Gates is one important leader in Time, had a meeting of especially artists and some planners and related folks in New York. And he's an accomplished rollerblader, and he wanted to rollerblade around in a larger auditorium with 600 plus artists. And they said, well, the floor was a little bumpy. So he completely rebuilt the floor, which shows his kind of attention to all aspects of architecture and the environment in order that he could rollerblade around. And so I had a session yesterday with German visitors who are coming via Skype online for a many-week tour and analysis of Chicago. And one of their main foci will be Theaster Gates. So we were talking about him. And so I said, he's an interesting example of a guru on roller skates, which is not what you normally think of as the gurus in India and in the jungles. But with Theaster Gates, you can have a guru on roller skates. And if that's the American version, what will be the future Chinese version that can go further than that? Okay, I'll leave that as a question. Okay, if that's an introduction, we are open for any and all questions and discussions. Please give us some questions. We also have one student presentation, which we will have later on if we run out of steam, but we'll save time for her in the end even if we have some questions up till then. Please. One thing I suggested you try to do is look for integrating themes to both think about, read, make notes on, and be prepared to write about yourself. That is, I've done so in an historical manner now, sort of framing the European contributions to placemaking and the continuity across continents. But I mean, obviously it's a very superficial answer, but one could take that kind of question and say, how does how does the theme of, say, travel relating to the arts, or travel in the sense of the Italian Renaissance, help redefine place, or the role of coffee? That is, the coffee houses in Europe came from traveler. That is, it was part of the Renaissance when the coffee came from Turkey, most proximately, and it became very popular in Europe very fast. Hundreds of coffee houses were, in a sense, redefining new places, which I'm mentioning in part because yesterday it was announced for the first time that the coffee cafes in France are reopening, I guess, yet today or yesterday, and they hope to be open through the summer. In Paris, they're only open as terraces, that is, so-called, on the street fronts, not indoors, but that may change as well. Questions, comments?
Hi, do you mind if I ask a question?
Please do, please do.
So I was wondering, when exactly was the shift from artists as this like mainstream, doing commission works for the church, to the artist seen as the bohemian outsider? Is there a specific time where that shift took place?
Well, I guess I would add to my historical comment the simultaneous effort by analysts like us here to also be cross-national, or let's say comparative. So while that was going on in the Renaissance, or that is becoming very important in the Renaissance in Italy, simultaneously you had other kinds of, well, I mentioned the Gothic style in Paris as being really a carryover from the Renaissance. That was ostensibly the church which organized it, but the work was done by what were called volunteers, that the people worked under high-level artists, but the main workers were, I won't say they're average people, but they were considered generally volunteers of citizens at the time. Probably the simplest answer to your question was that a major change was the French Revolution in 1789. And in a sense, if that was the formal ending of the royalty in France, the royalty lived on in different ways in other countries, but that led to the dramatic rise in a few years of a market for especially novels. And so the novel was the first popular non-patron driven form of art. And Dickens in England and Balzac in France were the two most popular examples. And Dickens was more, if you will, adaptable to different social circumstances. He toured in America, he went all around, he was hugely popular in the English-speaking world. By contrast, Balzac was more concerned with France and with making one neighborhood hospitable to artists, and the artist style in that neighborhood became the first definition of Bohemia, as he and others lived a much more so-called, the term came in later, a Bohemian lifestyle. And Balzac himself coined the term the flaneur, which was then used again by Baudelaire at the end of the century, Baudelaire, the poet of the goth girl outfit, and then of course philosophized about with Walter Benjamin. And but Benjamin wrote in the 1930s and was not read widely around the world, I would say, until after, again, the next big date I would say is 1968. The date of the Paris, the Berkeley, the Columbia student disturbances and African-American disturbances, very much like what we're seeing this week. So you had demonstrations in front of city halls in the major cities across America of three sorts: for African Americans, back and forth with their placards, their signs, clanking change. The Black Panthers were and so the diversity of styles I'm making here explicitly. You had not only Bohemians, you had Black power visibly articulated with the Black Panthers. You had Martin Luther King nonviolent protests. You had multiple African Americans meeting and trying to articulate to mayors what were the concerns of African Americans, as there were so many buildings burning and so many protests going on. And then different mayors responded to those differently, as we've written about. So protests were one, African American. Two, there were student anti-Vietnam War protests. And that was very active, not only in front of the mayors, these were on college campuses. There were confrontations with the police again and again, which were very difficult. Students were killed, etc. And then, so these then combined. So the third important one was municipal, that is local government, and to some degree state and federal government, but mostly local government pressures for unionization. And those three demonstrations were all going on simultaneously about 1968. Then the cultural version of this was the explosion as illustrated by the movie Bonnie and Clyde, where the hero and the heroine, when they were stopping and they saw someone who said, "What do you folks do?" He said, "Well, we rob banks." So bad was good and good was bad, and that, in a sense, was one definition of Bohemia. But you can find that in Bronzeville today. That black is good and white is bad. Bad is good is bad. I mean, explicit dichotomies being reversed to make ironic statements of various sorts. So, if those may be the quick and simple answers, bringing it up to present. Obviously, after 1968, we get a diversity, but I would say the degree to which the counterculture was initially launched, along with the kinds of things we see around us right now, reminds me that is the burning across the U.S. reminds me, of 1968. Or just one more sentence on that. I was at Columbia as a grad student myself. While I was finishing my PhD, I taught a couple of courses. At one point, I had maybe 40, 50 students, and an elderly man came up afterward one day, and he said, "You have the leaders of every major student organization on campus in this class." This was 1967. And I said, "Really? No, I didn't realize that." And I said, "How come?" So, "Well, your course has more Marx than any other course on campus. So they're all here to learn about Marx. And I'm here because I'm trying to follow them as well." I said, "Really? How come you're doing that?" "Well, I work for campus security, but I can't understand the discussions. So we're all here to learn." All right. So I trained the student Marxist revolutionary leaders of Columbia in 1967. And the next year, when I was here in Chicago, Columbia and Berkeley really were international explosions, along with Paris. And alas, it really destroyed Columbia as a major university. It was massive transformation right after. Lots of faculty left, students, et cetera, et cetera. But in brief, so I'd make the more general point that we all live directly feeling all of these elements of unionization. The counterculture is the persistent, that is, or just that one more sentence. The 1970s, you can say, then came after that. And with the 1970s, this culturally empowered the so-called new social movements: women, environmentalists, lesbians, gays, human rights. Those exploded in the 1970s, and the political parties ignored them in the US, but especially in Europe, when you might have expected they could be welcome, but they were not. So these were highly violent for several years in Germany and Italy in particular. Then they became incorporated into the political parties by the end of the 70s and into the 80s. And so we have all of these now within political parties and different caucuses, et cetera. But these were very, very confrontational in ways that Black Lives Matter now seems to be is the main active group. But I'm making the point that in '68 you had many, many more groups going on simultaneously. And so in that sense, I feel, that's the resonance I feel with '68 with what we see right now in the current discussions. Okay, so that's a quick answer. Interpretation, I'd say, began in a sense seriously with Benjamin and others and continues with us right now and goes on. We need your help for the future. And I'm pointing out that Alan brought some very nice perspective on this in a sense, saying that he said, I think it was your words, Alan. Did you say romantic nationalism was the last major innovation of Europe?
I said that was the last big cultural label in Europe, where people have a common approach to life. And after that, where life gets too complicated, then you cannot use anything to.
Okay, but in a sense of not just Wagner and the Romantics, but the introducing of the subjective, the emotions, the feelings. So Madison, when you spoke of Oklahoma City and you brought out the emotions powerfully yourself, that's the point of the 19th century, that we live in a world where the emotional and feelings have been legitimated and explicitly seen as central to understand art, not only arts and culture, but the economy, personality, and how places are made in conjunction with personal identity, personal dramatic event-making experiences, which in turn can spill over into a place and redefining a place. All right, other questions or any follow-up from you, Madison, on that?
Not off the top of my head, but I think that was a very informative way to kind of contextualize, so many hundreds of years all in, just a couple of minutes. So thank you.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry to hear on the news today there's more violence in Oklahoma City yesterday and today than the past. Okay, other questions, comments? Looking at the gallery here of our various names of folks. Several of you I've emailed with, but I'm looking at Alessandra Peak. I think we've emailed, haven't we? Or is your mic is off? If you want to speak or add something, I'd love to.
We have Olivia Turk asking about, I missed the first few minutes of the class. Did we discuss preparing for the final? We didn't say anything about the final at the beginning, but you're free to ask any question. I also tried very hard to make announcements on Canvas on everything, try to make it as explicit as possible. But if any question comes up, that would be great.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Or you can just type, we can answer.
But all of today is open to any questions about the final. That's our main topic. Alexandra, you had a good point yesterday. Anything following, or sorry, Monday, I guess, following up on that?
So I Probably I asked this question for many of our students because the piece by Levi Strauss is pretty dense for many of them. So one way that might better illuminate Levi Strauss, this binary system of interpreting nature and the world they're living for people he studied in many South America, is to apply this to our understanding of issues like race, gender. Simone de Beauvoir wrote his second sex using Levi Strauss at the beginning of his introduction. He used the idea of alterity. He said that human beings, they need to find the other in order to understand the subject themselves. And Levi Strauss lent some credence to this argument. So I just want to ask this question because some of the students say that piece is kind of complicated with lots of equations and symbols. So probably you can talk a little bit about that.
Okay, thank you, Alan. Yeah, I would not worry about the details, the specifics of the individual symbols, the individual specific arguments, and the concrete empirical cases. I would say I would read closely as well the what he calls the overture. That is, it is there where he directly links the work of anthropologists in the Brazilian jungles to the first world, the third world, and the first world, if you will, and so he engages briefly with many contemporary debates going on among especially intellectuals in Paris about the role of values, about the role of ideology, about where and how science can be joined with ideology. And he doesn't say we should do science separately. I mean, he did both ideology and science, as did people like Bourdieu and Raymond Aron and Adorno and Horkheimer. I mean, they were both engaged with, but some of them explicitly would separate between their roles as scientists on the one hand and more normative ideological spokesmen on the other. Levi Strauss and Piaget, both of whom I studied with simultaneously, both were the forefathers, in a sense, the fathers of what was called structuralism in Paris at the time. And basically that implied looking for structures in messy aspects of life more generally. And with the case of both Piaget as a psychologist and Levi Strauss as a background in sociology and anthropology, but they both were general intellectuals at the time, taking on and arguing with musicians like Pierre Boulez, literary critics, political theorists of all sorts. That is, all these people more frequently in other countries of the world than in the US. I mean, we get it a bit here, but it's more concentrated in Paris and in some countries that may be smaller, such as in Latin America, and some of the Latin American countries, you get more of this style. In that sense, both Levi Strauss and Piaget were absolutely brilliant as individuals, as scholars, and as ideological and analytical leaders and debaters about what was going on in life in general. So in that sense, it's all the more dramatic for Levi Strauss to go back to the Brazilian tribes and he had in his head, we don't know exactly how much was just in his head, but used in his books, he used them all the time. That is the British empirical tradition, the British anthropological approach, generally much more case studies of individual tribes and individual towns. in a much more micro, untheorized way from the perspective of the Parisians. So Levi Strauss did not spend a lot of time, he was in the jungles for a while, but he spent most of his time in Paris theorizing about this. But he did so in a bigger, grander way, but he wanted to use structure. Structure more specifically meant for him often linguistic structure. So the structure of language was a model that he used rather than, he talked a little bit about mathematics or physics, but linguistics was in a sense, the foundation, you could say, of culture, that what we speak is shared in language. And so the ways that linguists had developed their analyses were a model which we often use, de Saussure and specifically, but also others. And well, then back to the American pragmatist Charles Saunders Peirce was really considered the founder of modern linguistics with his sign and signal and so forth. But he took these, but then he first applied these to kinship. So his major work was called the Elementary Structures of Kinship, where there was the model of linguistics, but it did not have myth. So these myths, which are the focus of the reading in the four volumes on mythologie, these were in addition in the middle of his career in ways that made him distinctly important, potentially, but I would say it was not literally applied and used actively by very many people in France, and definitely not in the US or the English-speaking anthropological or sociological world. But I would say as we now turn and look more seriously at different ways of linking the arts with the social sciences, Levi Strauss looks more appealing than many of the alternatives, which have virtually no theory or no effort to theorize at all, which is the tradition of art history generally, or much of cultural policy traditionally that has a more descriptive, maybe some linkage with evaluation studies, but you don't tend to get the grand theory in the manner that Levi Strauss tried to do it, to join all of these together in a way that was meaningful and original and illuminating for all, such as showing how. And so, for instance, in the discussion with the German visitors yesterday, I said, one thing to pay attention to in interpreting Chicago is that African Americans, especially lower status African Americans, live largely in matriarchal family structures. The men are not integrally linked to much of the family. The women are the drivers. They own the homes. They have the regular jobs. They pay their taxes. Harold Washington was elected as mayor, and as mayor, he was investigated by the IRS and said, you haven't paid your taxes. He said, I've never paid any taxes in my life. That in a sense was, and so he was the first African-American mayor. He was culturally shocking in doing something like that occasionally. At the same time, under Harold Washington, the first serious cultural policy statement was also created in Chicago. And Mrs. Harris whose husband was Mr. Harris of the Harris School, she was the commissioner of cultural policy under Harold Washington, and the Harris Theater, which is just the north end of the Chicago Millennium Park, was named for the Harris family because of the contributions which they made specifically, and she raised more money for that building. But my point is that there are important gender differences among African Americans which have that it, or let me back up, say one more thing here. In 1968, or soon after 68, there was the Moynihan Report, which discussed the problems of urban unrest. It was commissioned. It was a Harvard and other study. Moynihan then became a U.S. Senator from Massachusetts. He'd grown up in New York. He was very smart, analytical, but he talked about the Black family. and it led some people blamed the Moynihan report in ways which they said he's labeling the Black family as the source of the problem, and that was not at all the case. But what this led to was the idealization of African American families in ways that there was virtually no research by anthropologists or sociologists, psychologists for about 20 years. William Julius Wilson here recommenced, he started again studying and writing about the African American family in a serious way about 20 years later. He was then the most respected sociologist in the U.S. He's been at Harvard for about 15 years now, but he did his important work here. The bigger point of that is that we can use some of our tools. Well, let me add a couple of themes about why do I live in Bronzeville? I learn continually. I love living in Bronzeville. I'm a proud Bronzeville resident. When there was a conflict between the location of the Obama Library in Hyde Park, we also had a bid, and I worked with my Bronzeville neighbors to say why we would be a better place for the library, and I'm working now actively with the aldermen and folks here. I'm co-authoring a report on Bronzeville Soul with the minister of the Olivet Baptist Church, Reverend Smith, and Enrique Beckman, who's the former chairman of the board of Michael Reese Hospital, and Sharon Pope, who's a resident activist and lots of things in Bronzeville and with her family for decades. We are trying to capture the essence of Bronzeville, and one of the we can write about institutions, we can write about the emergence of jazz, of gospel, of the clubs, of the speakeasies. We can show how it comes up to date in the high school across the street, where Jennifer Hudson became went to school, and she's now a superstar in Hollywood and with her videos, etc. So the point of that is that culture in the way that it has developed here is probably more important than any other neighborhood in Chicago. That is, Chicago's major cultural contribution probably comes more from Bronzeville than anywhere else. And the folks here are proud of this. And so the gender roles, the focus on what's important, comes out in ways that. Or one more example. When we had one of our PhD students doing a thesis, he was going around in Woodlawn and other areas with cameras and making some videos. He'd regularly be approached by African American teenagers saying, "Hey, will you shoot me doing my rap song because you've got a nicer camera than I have, and I wanna put it on YouTube." That is practically every time he did field work, this happened. So his image is that, practically every young African-American guy who's let's say 17 to 25 is making videos. Forrest Stewart, then, here's an assistant professor. I think we showed a little bit from him, didn't we? Yeah. So showing that you have competition among these guys for no longer for turf and murder, but for YouTube ratings. In that sense, that specific sense, turf, placemaking, the arts, video making are interrelated in dramatically new ways, which are, and the book doing this is not yet out. It's coming out about this month. It's called it was called initially the Battle of the Bullet. It's now called the Ballad, B-A-L-L-A-D, of the Bullet. But it's the ways that the bullet is artistically transformed by editors and reframing in that way. And so the elements of violence are joined with culture very directly in ways that Forrest has thoughtfully sought to conceptualize. So I'm wandering a little bit around Levy Strauss, but I'm trying to do so in ways that articulate with the today's examples the way that Levy Strauss was actively and integrally involved in the kinds of debates that were going on in Paris and in Columbia, in Berkeley at the time. And what he tried to bring was a sense of science, that we could scientifically analyze conflict. We could scientifically analyze matriarchal versus patriarchal conflicts. And so we have a generally, I mean, one of the negative labels of the oppressor or the bad person in African American simple terminology is the man. It's not the mother. The mother is sometimes used with another adjective, but the man is the outside white capitalist dominant figure. And that's, if you will, a patriarchal, and so the myth is, the classic myth is the Oedipus myth. And so in the Oedipus myth, the man is imposing this forcing of the son to roll the rock up for the rest of his life. Whereas Levy Strauss points out, if you have a matriarchal society, you're going to have myths where the mother is attacked, or at least she is the source of oppression. And the myths, and he has hundreds of these different myths, where women are on the shoulders of men for their entire lives. They're kicking them, they're scraping them, they're scraping out one eye, they're putting them into the water where the fish eat their feet. I mean, there are all kinds of torturing variations of this, but what Levy, I mean, so I'm giving you this simple example rather than, what you say I'm implicitly not doing. I'm not trying to say here's one diagram or one dichotomy or one way of doing it which you should memorize and do. I'm doing, on the contrary, I'm looking for the big ideas, the insightful things, contributions which Levy Strauss brought to culture and the arts more generally, and the impact which he may have in the future by and others in conjunction, that is in conjunction with his inspiration, could potentially pursue and extend. So put differently, we now have better data. We have all kinds of big data, all kinds of subtle ethnographic data like Forrest Stewart's. We've got all kinds of new topics which can be joined, but the tools, the basic ideas, so let me back up one more step to join this again with what I said about Wagner, and then what you said, Alan, about the Romantic nationalism. What the foundation of these dichotomies and the specific themes or myths are, of course, identical to Wagner's leitmotifs. And this is stated in the preface by Levy Strauss himself. He said the inspiration for this book came from Wagner's essays on leitmotifs. But the point is not to be atomistic in breaking them down into individual themes. And so we saw them as musical themes in the persons of the Valkyries. I mean, so that theme is taken over and used by Fellini and used in advertising and television and so forth. But the point is, the themes are then joined together into what he called a Gesamtkunstwerk, that is an integrated, holistic artwork. And that is an inspiration, in a sense, for our idea of the scene. And what it says, and what Wagner said, and what Levy Strauss says, is don't just look at one dichotomy or one conflict. Look at the context which generates that conflict and transforms the myth or the language, the themes around it. And so the labels may be the man is bad or the mother is oppressing me, but there are many, many variations which he goes into. But what Levy Strauss adds to Wagner is a more explicit focus on context. So in that sense, well, we're in a sense the context for Wagner, you could say, on one hand, on the one level, is the German culture as an integral whole, or the German would-be nation, as there was no German nation at that time. But the Levy Straussian most powerful examples, as I pointed out briefly, in a more elementary, undifferentiated society such as the Brazilians that he studied, tended to be structured more by kinship. And so matriarchy, patriarchy was one of the most important, and then he would go on into cross-cousin marriage. And so one way to transform the definition of and the types of myths which emerged about different kinds of cousins, whether they're with a cousin within your family or a cousin from an outside family, and whether and who could or should not marry what kind of cousin, differentially transformed the myths. That is, that the outside, more distant cousin was usually distrusted. He was an outsider. He was marginal. He had to prove himself in some way. But in a sense, Levi Strauss was making the point that the society would not just be less incestual, but it would be more integrated and more connected with other tribes in the area if it had family relations with them. In a sense, if you have Romeo and Juliet marrying each other rather than just killing each other from each other's families, that's a way that those two families could be potentially brought together. So in a sense, Levi Strauss was building the building blocks of joining, as you've heard me say many times, joining the context with the theory, with the elements of the theory. So I'd say those are the big points to retain, rather than the specific names. I mean, wax and gold and so forth are somewhat arbitrary, and I haven't given you a one single label, but I'd say those are some of the biggest takeaways. Any follow up on that from Alan or anyone else?
So yeah, I just heard that Levi Strauss structuralism is not particularly interested in history, and there are some anthropologists following his step, but adding a little bit historical sense. For example, a Chicago anthropologist who wrote the book about the Neolithic age, how people, I think that, so I don't know how Levi Strauss used history in his theory, and but I guess, I mean, his big idea is take history out of a context and trying to find the structural, the persisting logic behind what's going on in many cultures.
As Faulkner said, the past is not over, it's not even past. That is, we live in nothing but history all the time. But the question is, even if we rebaptized ourselves as historians, let's say we're historians, what are we going to say about what will we do, or let's say how to interpret what's going on yesterday or in the last week or the last 300 years, whatever we choose to say to interpret what's happening in Chicago right now with the urban disturbances combined with the COVID-19. That is, my suggestion is that we would, whether we wear our hat as more of a social scientist or an historian, we have to use history. So now what he did in a sense was to try to distill the myths, and the myths were often in the framework of the tribes which he took them from, framed as part, I mean, they in many respects, they were the history of the tribe. That is, they were, if you take, say, what are the classic works, the greatest works of ancient Greece were of the Iliad and the Odyssey of Homer. And Aristotle then wrote his book about aesthetics and the arts, and his main examples were Homer's works. And those were ostensibly part of the history or elements of the history of Greece, but they were distilled into art in ways that you had specific battles among key individuals, but they were not seen only as art. They were seen as part of a definition of who I am, who we are, and where these come together. So I guess I'm calling for, or just to take one more example in one sentence, Piaget would regularly illustrate almost every one of his major theories with his own daughter growing up and what she did at age 7, age 12, age 14, and how we could understand all of psychology through what his daughter did at different ages. So is that history? Maybe so, maybe not, but I'm simply suggesting that we can learn from one another, from the social science disciplines and the division here, including history, but also including the arts as a distillation of the cultural background that also informs our aesthetic perspectives, and that we need all of these. We can't use them all. We can't learn all the technical aspects of everything simultaneously. We can't master the details of the historical sources, but if we choose selective areas to work on, we can build on, say, cross-cousin marriage, or on the idea of a integrated artwork or something like that, and then try to pursue that as it's been done, and then look at that in the past, with or without. And so if Levy Strauss said my inspiration was Wagner, is that history or not? On the one level, yes, but certainly the elements he distilled from Wagner became more abstract, and he would call them structural. But the term structure is used in 1,000 incompatible ways, and I wouldn't stress that so much as a, if you will, an analytical perspective is enough. But some of the most creative historians built up an analytical perspective with rich historical examples, Max Weber being probably the most important example for many of the 21st century social scientists. He was trained as an economic historian, not a social scientist.
All right. So we have a couple of questions from Olivia, with the final focus more on the second half of the quarter. I would say the ID will have 70, maybe 60 to 70% from the second half. But still we have some ID from the first half, but the majority of the IDs are the second half. But you guys are free to choose 4 out of, let's say, 10 to 12 IDs. So you have, a lot of options depending on your familiarity with the terms. And Zhilin Chen asked a question about the priority for the final and the readings labeled with no star or stars. I think our essay questions are generally broad, and we try to alleviate your burden of focusing too much on the specifics. So we just follow, it's better to follow a professor's idea of integrating things, having some general idea of what's being discussed in the course, and try to improvise. I mean, 70% of the essay, answer is theater, 30% is, reading and understanding of the basic ideas. So I don't suggest you to be too dogmatic, because this course is, you know, open. It's an open road, and you don't have to focus too much on the tiny details. And also for Olivia, if you want to have a different time for your early final, you'd better contact Jimmy. He is the contact person for to administer the both the early final and the regular final. So he will set up the canvas, and your exam would be disclosed to you at that particular time you requested. So just talk to Jimmy.
Or email.
Yeah, through email to Jimmy, and all TAs as well, CC us. Okay, for the participation, discussion post, memos, I think I need to show you where I post the assignment in here. The memo submission is in the assignments. You click the memo submission in here, and you see all these useful instructions. If you are late today, we can extend as far as June the 5th. That's Friday this week. So we give you a little bit more flexibility. But if you have already submitted, you don't have to do it over again. We generally view your memo as how much you have participated. We wouldn't read very closely of everything you have written. So I suggest that you just copy and paste what you have written over this course. Just copy and paste in one big file in PDF, in doc, and submit in here. So we have 100 students in the class. Sometimes it's just impossible for us to get people message through emails. So this is the only place we'll look into for your submission. Are there particular terms or concepts from the second half of the quarter that you recommend that we go back and review? So the terms we pick are usually the foremost big idea in any paper or chapters. So if you really want to do the ID well, just try to figure out what the title of the essay is. We usually pick the ID from the title, or from, if you go to the finding section or discussion section of the paper, you usually will get a sense of the big argument of that chapter or essay. So don't try to figure out everything. Just get to know the big picture. So we didn't tell you which ID you should focus on, because if I tell you that ID wouldn't be in the exam list, right? So it's hard for me to tell you some very specific examples. But 70% will come up from the second half, 30% from the first half, and you have a lot of flexibility choosing 4 out of perhaps 10 to 12 IDs. So I think I'm sharing my screen here. Someone asked where on Canvas. Yeah, in here, in memo submission, assignments. Would doing extra discussion posts be extra beneficial to our participation grade? Yeah, definitely. We definitely have a sense of the quantity and quality of your discussion posts once you put them in one big file. And we also recognize your names, your question, your presentation, made over the course. So we will, integrate all this in the 10% of the score for your grades. So it's all in the syllabus. It's 10% of the final grades. And the submission of the memo, yeah, you can submit by Friday. We're okay because we won't look into your memo until Friday or on weekends. Are memos mandatory? No. If you don't want to get a lot of extra credit, extra credit in your final, it's about 10%, right? But we also consider your presentation, your questions over the course, your names, your presence in here is also considered. So, yeah. And remember the pass and fail, I mean, according to university is C minus. The C minus is impossible in our class. I mean, the lowest score in the midterm is 83. That's about B minus. So the best idea I suggest is to try to take the final, and if you can get higher than B minus, I mean, like B or B plus, it's better than getting a pass. I don't know how much it would affect your future academic or career if you get a B plus as opposed to P, but I would suggest you take a chance. The final is written by all of us, and we spend a lot of time on that. And it's also a good way for you to get some feedback. And we want to give more, we want to recognize your hard work. We don't want to, but if you take pass or fail, we will have less workload. So that not necessarily too bad for us, but we also encourage you to do the final. So everything is on syllabus. Do not look into global local politics. Many of us try to kind of nostalgic, telling me what happened in local politics, global local politics can be also transferred in this course. I would say not really. We have two different TA this quarter. I'm the only link between the past and the present, but I cannot say, we model on last quarter. So it's all in the syllabus. It's very clear. So you only need to do one thing. Just submit all your discussion post memo in one big file and submit by Friday. You can do it today, but we wouldn't mind if you submit by Friday. So we want to make everything streamlined because we cannot just read email on the one hand and read your submission on Canvas for another. That would be 100 people, having all sorts of files in different places. That would be too difficult for us to get everything done quickly. We have 3 TAs and there's still a lot of work.
Are those most of the explicit questions, Alan?
Yeah, I think I have addressed
Okay.
all of
Now,
them.
I'm looking through in conjunction with one of the first. What are some of the big concepts in the second half of the course? And I'm flipping through the two main readings with stars are Elazar and the City is an Entertainment Machine. And I'm looking through, we talked about Elazar. It's a short paper, fairly straightforward. The three cultural types as distinguishing and contrasting the New England, the Middle Atlantic, and the South, I've talked about several times, and they're embedded in propositions here in the book, The City's an Entertainment Machine. Um, um, let me maybe elaborate on a few of these, which are in the form of some specific propositions, as well as linkages to other themes through the course. As this aims to, this in a sense was a review of the general literature. It's not work by me narrowly in any way, although there is original data even in the chapter called The Political Theory of Consumption. But it was framed to try to cover what are the best big ideas we can find about entertainment broadly. And then that became more subsequently focused on the arts specifically. But if we join them through the two meanings of the term culture as meaning both, say, theatrical performance and the rules of the game by which we live our lives, those two meanings come together in much of the propositions here. Why? Proposition 3 suggests as resources and products rise in number and diversity, individuals can explore and consume a broader range of products and activities. The most drastic changes or shifts from highly parochial villages, think of Levy Strauss, to global markets. This change came rapidly to many locations around the world with the end of the Cold War, cheap air travel, the internet, television news, etc. These cosmopolitanization, globalization factors undermine many social background, individual, and cohort effects isolated in past research. So that's proposition 3. Kiji and I were talking about this yesterday as a theme which the Chinese are really in the midst of right now, in the sense that rural-urban remains a major social division within China. In a sense, you might even say it's the Chinese analog of African-American white in the US. But the Chinese rural closed, more parochial style is dramatically changed. It has become far more open, far more cosmopolitan, interpenetrated by cell phones, by migration back and forth in ways that thinking and talking about cosmopolitanism as culture or rural, instead of speaking of rural in our 15 dimensions of scenes, we talk about urbane, not just urban, but urbane. So you can be rural and urbane. You can live in a Colorado mountaintop and, listen to music from 300 years ago, or compose your own poetry, or make your own stock market transactions or whatever. So the point is, the whole focus and interest, not only by social scientists, but by policymakers, is driven by the rise of those historical factors I discussed. After 1968, one of the most visible driving factors in linking it back to 1789 was greater equality and recognition of diversity among more kinds of people. And given this equality, this right to participate, and this engagement, these are fundamental values which are shared around now much of the world, in China as well as in the West. These in turn, as we then have more resources, as people spend a proportion of their time only working. That is, people worked 80 hours, 90 hours a week, often 7 days a week in the 19th century. And at the beginning, they would work like that in factories, or they would work on their own farms. They just worked nonstop because they were so-called subsistence farmers. They just barely could get enough to eat and to live. And so as by the late 19th century, with more differentiation of labor, with the manufacturing, with the more products and more services, people had more leisure time. And that gradually led to the explosion after World War II with all these manufactured products as well as services. And that now leads to how can consumption not only drive the economy and the political system, but give us a focus which we can elaborate. And so Kiji really has, she looks as if she's just smiling at you quietly. She has worked on, she started and quasi-finished at least the core of 3 books in the middle of her visit here with taking care of her son in Chicago in a foreign country, perfecting her English, writing 3 books. At the same time, she's been consulting actively with high-level government officials on the coronavirus and on the role of the arts and the problems that these are posing with the shutdown of all kinds of facilities in China as there are here. So be inspired, as am I, by seeing what she is doing. And she is linking us to the ways in which people in China are thinking about how these issues are so fundamentally important for people in China today. Flipping forward. The prime change among the 3 types of the Elazar sort is the movement of the national culture toward elements of New England moralism, not in its, this is proposition 10, not in its traditional local and puritanical form, but in cosmopolitan moralism, a broad concern to apply morality to politics, reforming leadership patterns to more fully implement ideals of democracy, due process, equal citizen rights, fighting clientelism and corruption, advocating transparency in administrative procedures, and the like. Okay, Black Lives Matter is directly moralistic. Like Theaster Gates, it draws heavily on these ideas from the Bible and from 1789, from Martin Luther King, and is saying there is a conflict between these moralistic concerns of how we should live and how some people, the man, is acting today. And whether it's the man in the White House or the man in a blue uniform, the man is sometimes acting irresponsibly. And so articulating these is much of what we see in the debates and in the discussions. I say this because in the Middle Ages, there was much less visible, in many military contexts at least, discussion explicitly of morality. Genghis Khan came in, he conquered, he burned down the entire cities of the capital cities of China and Russia, but he also was sensitive to what people had in their heads. He had people in his armies who were Muslims, who were Christians, who were of many different religious background, and as long as they worked together, they were tolerant of one another's perspectives. So tolerance, and then where and how we can have and so I would say in that sense, Genghis Khan was a cosmopolitan. He also was cosmopolitan enough, he used a lot of what was called intelligence. That is, he tried to learn about the people, the capital cities, in order that he could invade and that he could win. But he used information about them by talking to leading informants so he could try to understand, how did the Chinese do this? How did the Russians do that? Where should I attack? What should I not attack? Where do I not want to waste my troops? So he did not go into India. He did not go into mountainous areas. He didn't go too far north. He stayed in the Great Plains but he also had he had a sense of the cultural sensitivity of this stuff. And Alan knows more about this. He's had a whole course on it. But these are with us today in different forms. Okay, so but I'm saying, even if that's the background, the moralism has become much more visibly important in the world, and it's newer and a harder change for China, I would say, than for instance, India. India has had a stronger sense of morality for hundreds of years. So that, as I've mentioned, I think when A.K. Sen, the economist, was given a Nobel Prize, he said the most important innovation of the 20th century was, and then I've asked people, and I'll ask you, what would he say if he were an American or a Chinese economist? And many of you are majoring in economics. What would you have answered, or what might he have answered? He showed that he was an Indian economist by answering democracy. That was a striking statement, which illustrates my point about the rising salience of moralism, as moralism is far more central and salient, and it varies in different parts of India and different issue areas, but it's getting the moral upper hand and how to frame and reframe these actions is part of myth. And so seeing how Levy Strauss does this, of seeing how different myths have emerged which frame these interpretations in different ways, is something which we're trying to articulate and using different sources in this course. So I'm going through some salient propositions, sort of some big ideas. Another one is so-called personal influence. Can anybody tell us what that concept's on page 61, what personal influence is? It was in a book, especially by Katz and Lazarsfeld. Anybody aware of this from reading it here or in other courses? That's the title of the book, Personal Influence. The idea from Adorno, which we read, the idea is most sharply in the Adorno-Horkheimer paper on Hollywood, was that the Hollywood film goes into your head, you the viewer. Lazarsfeld said, no, that's not the way ideas get in people's heads. People talk about films with each other. They talk about the events in Beijing or in downtown Chicago together. They go to church, and with their friends in church, they talk about the meaning of life during the other 6 days of the week. That is, or people on Saturday, so examples which are in the books from the past. Many women he would discuss, would go shopping together on Saturday, and they might, as I have said, they might go shopping for shoes, and then they say, what color shoes should each of us get? Should you get red shoes or blue shoes or green shoes, and which fit with your personality, which fit with your dress, and why? And so they might talk about this for 2 or 3 hours, but they also might have lunch. They might talk about their children, about their problems with their husbands, and who are you going to vote for? Politics, and joining that with, does this fit with what the Bible says? I mean, is that man in the White House really a Christian? By going over to that church, was he using that Bible in manipulative way when the leader of the church says this just you're using the church and the Bible for a political statement? Okay, that kind of thing is discussed in a personal primary group, as it's also called. So the point of Lazarsfeld, who was an immigrant from Austria, where he had worked really in Marxist circles with leftist organizations, very tough, classic, hierarchical Marxist style, when he came to America, he said the image of the American political system is how you buy tomato soup or how you buy red shoes. It's consumption. So he saw it. So Alan talked to you about from the Renaissance to Romantic nationalism. He has the eyes of an outsider, which show more to him. He gets the big ideas more easily, perhaps, as did Lazarsfeld coming here. He said, you know, this is hugely different from Vienna. This is Tomato Soup Company. And Andy Warhol, 30 years, 20 years later, made a poster which is one of the most famous archetypical posters of American art and consumption today. The tomato, you know, the Campbell's tomato soup can. All right, so that may be simplistic stuff, but it's the stress on what was then called the two-step theory of communication, that the media, the mass media or the social media or the tweet may come down to the individual, but then people may or may not read them. They may talk about them with their friends, and that process of talking with friends who they trust, and it may not be trust about everything. It may be if you have, say, 3 women buying shoes, one may be really good at color, or I heard a radio interview recently about a chef, a restaurant, and the chef says, you know, with this COVID virus in Yugoslavia, all of the farmers are going bankrupt. They can't sell their milk. And so we in the restaurant, we can't have any meals. So what we did was we tried to figure out how to make a product with all this excess milk that's being poured into the sewers. So they started making ice cream, and she said, you know, we have divisions in the kitchen, and mine is taste. That's an issue-specific expertise. So think of these 3 women. Taste could be one expertise, color could be one, and civic and political life could be a third. So it might be that the 3 women turn to have a sort of quasi-informal, I won't say leadership, that may be too strong a term, but they may defer or listen more to the one who knows more about each of these 3 different things. And that's a different model from Marx. That's a different model from Bourdieu. It's a different model of how life works. And Lazarsfeld really transformed the study of politics. He really made it into a science by starting initially with a book called The People's Choice, and then the second one, the People's Choice, the Personal Influence, another one called Voting. Basically, these built the modern models that we have of how people analyze the political system today. So out of that comes the idea of issue specificity. So that is, issue specificity is focusing on this on how tweets, for instance, about one theme like having the civil rights, quote unquote, to be able to walk from my White House over to that church and back. Is that a civil right, or is that a photo op statement, or is it, that is, those labels are the framing, that is, it's the linkage of the act, the behavior, with the different meanings which the cultural sub-themes can variously reframe it as. And that's, in a sense, I'm illustrating Levy Strauss again, that the same myth gets transformed in different contexts. So any reactions? I don't want to talk on too much, and we are near the end. But any last question? Oh no, we have a student presentation. Sorry, I'm talking.
But so you said probably she can talk to you after the class.
Okay. No, if that's yeah, I apologize. How about just 2 sentences on what's available? Why don't we say, we will end the class formally. Everybody can sign off as you choose. However, if some of you want to stay on, we will have a brief showing it. The normal limit is 8 minutes, and we will have a session on Chinatown, and Chinatowns nationally. But does anyone else have a last comment or question which they want to bring in? Okay, let me then end by saying thank you You have all contributed in multiple ways, most of which has not been visible here, but we've all learned in this course together. It's been a dramatically challenging time for all of us in different ways. Thank you. We'll look forward to more. Keep in touch, and let's hope we can help each other as time continues into the future. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
So Xiaoyu, you are co-host now, so you can share your screen. If you have any slides to share, just click the green share screen button.
Is there a button of sharing screen?
I think you accidentally made me co-host instead.
Yeah, if you move your cursor down,
Yeah.
yeah, you see the green arrow in the box, green box.
Oh, I see it.
Then click on share screen.
It says the host forbids I'm not the co-host of the conference, so I cannot share screen.
So let me make you host.
Okay.
I think co-host can also share the screen, but let me give you the highest.
Wait, you made me a co-host. I'm not the one presenting.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Got it wrong. So, Miayu, could you give the host back to me and?
Yeah, how do I do that?
Yeah, so you just click on participants and you find Xiaoyu.
Okay.
Yeah, and you.
Oh, okay.
You click on her. Yeah, okay. Xiaoyu is the host now. Sorry for misrecognizing you.
I'm sorry. Just wait a second. I'm opening a link. Can you see my screen now?
Perfect, yes.
Perfect.
So my project is about Chicago's Chinatown. So the title is Revisiting Chicago's Chinatown. I will talk about the ethnicity, scenescapes, and its relation to gentrification. Because the Chinatowns in the US are shrinking these days because of gentrification, but the Chinatown in Chicago is the only one that is still growing. So in my course project, I want to explore the reason why Chicago's Chinatown is still growing while others are fading. So I first want to talk about how ethnicity and scene are related in Chinatown, because Chinatown in the era of globalization can be seen as an ethnic growth machine. It presents itself as other to attract consumers. So it is actually a commercialization of the Chinese culture, and it presents itself as other to other races, but to itself, it is a self-sufficient ethnic enclave, the home to the Chinese people, and the businesses in Chinatown are consumed by the Chinese residents in Chinatown. So I think these two concepts are significant in revisiting Chinatown as the other and the home to the Chinese residents. So this is what this is what is particular about Chicago's Chinatown. It is different from other Chinatowns in the US in terms of the ethnicity and the scenescapes. So I compare the socio-demographic data to the Chinatown in LA, in the New York City, in Boston, etc. I use both cross-sectional data and longitudinal data to see the trend across time and the comparison, the screenshot comparison. And the three most significant findings are that the Chinese population in Chicago's Chinatown are mainly from mainland China. So mainland China, the people who speak Mandarin at home is the largest group in the largest population group in Chinatown. And the business, the restaurants and the groceries, I think at least more than half of them are run by the people from mainland China, both from northern China and from the the southern provinces of China. So this is what makes Chicago's Chinatown different from other Chinatowns in the US, like from the Chinatown in LA, where the Cantonese population and the Cantonese dim sum restaurants and business are the majority of the business. And the second finding is that the population in Chicago's Chinatown are heavily working class. They're not gentrified, they're still working class population who work, who earn their lives depending on labor, manual work, and on running small businesses and manufacturing. And the third finding is that the population aging problem. This is how the degree of assimilation of the Chinese population in Chicago's Chinatown is very low. So this also contributes to the the low degree of gentrification in Chinatown. So the three most important characteristics of the population in Chinatown has contributed to a heightened sense of belonging and identity among the Chinatown community. And it's also contributed to the reason why Chicago's Chinatown is not being gentrified. And I want to show you a short clip of my documentary on Chicago's Chinatown to show you how the demographic characteristics cause the scenescapes, the scenes, the art scene, the visual symbols, the heritage, the architectural style in Chicago's Chinatown is how they're different from Chinatowns in other cities in the US, and how the scenescapes make the Chinatown in Chicago so different. So I will play the first 2 minutes of my documentary.
Old Chinatown offers a colorful bit of the Orient.
American-born children still learn to write in Chinese.
The Chinese family continues as a basic unit.
One of my favorite pastimes is to go to a dim sum house.
All these real Chinese dishes are over here.
The further you walk, the more Chinese it gets.
Most generous gift, American sausage. It's Chinatown.
Some tourists think Chinatown is a mini-size China. I disagree.
我有个朋友说，这是我们第一次来 Chinatown， 有朋友说 Chinatown 就像80年代的香港。
The people live around Chinatown the most is the workers.
Oh, 我喜欢中国城近年来的发展，因为呢，我们中国人真的是能解决了中国胃的问题。你看餐馆呢，还有杂货店啊，都装修了，越开越大。而且很多的超市越来越多，他们也装修好了，货源也充足。这是很好的。还有路面也扩大了，你看现在 Ramos 啊，这都是很好的事情。能够满足中国人的需求嘛，就是这个我们的解乡愁了。小的时候吃过的东西，现在都大部分都可以买得到。我的名字叫郑品端，英文名字叫呢
Yeah, so that's it. That's the clip. Sorry, that's the clip I want to show. So I want to analyze the scenes in Chinatown, and to find why the scene makes Chicago's Chinatown different from other Chinatowns in the U.S. and why it is not being gentrified. So I want to know what is the particularity about Chicago's Chinatown. So the first very prominent finding is that the visual symbols, the heritage in Chicago's Chinatown. You can actually see that the architectural style of Chicago's Chinatown is very different, and as shown in this picture, you can see that began in the 1990s. The first phase of the redevelopment in the Chinatown is this Chinatown Square. To attract tourists, it builds this kind of architectural style, and it adopted an elaborate Oriental theme. You can see from the picture that I took on the Chinatown Square, this featured a central plaza surrounded by surrounded by 12 marble statues of the zodiac in China, which is just like outside the square of this area, and you can see that it also adopted a style of a courtyard, which is the traditional northern Chinese style. So the mural and the gateways conveyed a strong sense of pride among Chinese immigrants toward their culture and history. And aside from the central plaza, Chinatown Square took the form of an outdoor shopping mall with boutiques and restaurants from the ground floor and offices above. The shopping street running through the site adopted a courtyard style with bridges spanning across at the second floor and archways located at each end. and side works were covered by overhanging balconies supported by columns, while diamond-shaped windows and geometrically patterned metal screens along the stairs and balconies added a further oriental touch. And you can see that this is the major style, architectural style of the plaza, and it also maintained this kind of balcony architectural style in the old Chinatown area, and this is the courtyard in the new Chinatown area. It all means to attract tourists, but it also remains its own cultural style. And the second characteristic of the scene is that it lacked a new bohemian art scene. For example, you can see the new bohemian art scene in Los Angeles Chinatown. You can see that there are some very edgy avant-garde museums, art galleries, and but this is not found in Chicago's Chinatown. The only Chinese museum in Chicago's Chinatown is located in the Poitak Center, which is an education center for the second generation immigrants, but it is not popular. It is not bohemian. The art scene has not really emerged in Chicago's Chinatown. And I think this is one of the most important reasons why Chicago's Chinatown is not being gentrified. Comparing to other Chinatowns for example, in LA and in Boston, in Manhattan, and in Philadelphia. And this is the second characteristic of the scenescapes. And the third I want to mention is the Chinese community's fear of crime. The crime rates in Chinatown is actually 30% lower than other regions in Chicago, but the Chinese people are still very afraid of crime, especially violent crime and poverty crime. And the Chinese population are really afraid of the paintings, the murals on the wall, because they think this is a symbol of violence. And the community put a lot of effort into collective advocacy to persuade the government to put more effort into the infrastructure in Chicago's Chinatown. So this collective actions result in tangible results in infrastructure and aesthetic improvements in Chinatown. And you can see a large public museum that was built in Chinatown, and it serves as a public education facility, and it also serves as a concept of safety in the Chinatown, in the Chinese population. So the...
Excuse me, Alan, I'm just confirming, we're still recording, aren't we?
Yes.
Okay, good. No, because this is wonderful. I'm just
Part of the course, so
making sure it's available for others afterward. So thank you, but please carry on.
Yeah,
great images.
So the so these are the scenes in Chinatown. So I want to briefly conclude sorry, I forgot to show a table of the data that I found and compared. On the left side is the race and the origins of the Asian population in Chicago. You can see here that the Asian population accounts for 88% in Chicago's Chinatown. While in Los Angeles, this figure is only 57%. So there is 22% of white population, 6% of Black or African American population, and some other races. So this is why Chicago's Chinatown is so different, because the Asian population is so large, and when you specifically look at the Chinese population, you can see that the people from mainland, that is from mainland China, excluding Hong Kong and Taiwan, the proportion is really huge. It's 87%. While in LA, this figure is only like 50%. So this is why Chicago's Chinatown is so different, because the restaurants, the business, and the scene they're both influenced by the demographic, by the socio-demographic characteristic of the Chinese population. It is because the population are mostly from mainland China that the scene was as a result, the scenes were so different from the scenes in other Chinatown. And talking about the fear of crime, I think that this has something to do with the Chinese culture, but I don't want to specifically focus on this notion of the perception of crime in this course project, because it does not seem that relevant. But I have formed a regression to test the crime in Chinatown, because I think the crime is about the immigration paradox. The paradox is that despite having often low levels of income, but the second generation of the immigrants, they tend to have higher employment rates and lower rates of crime, and their children, they save money for their children so their children can go to have better schooling, better educations relative to native-born Americans. So I think we can use this regression to test whether this is true, whether the in-movers are immigrants. That is, in the Chinatown area, even though there is a large turnover of the population, that is the population mobility, which is thought to be related to crime, because they think the more the population move between neighborhoods, the more instability it creates. So the more crime rates, the larger crime rates it will generate. But is it actually true that the fact that the in-movers are immigrants kind of moderate this adverse effect of neighborhood turnover? So we can use the outcome variable, the dependent variable, as the crime. We can divide it in the poverty crime and violent crime. We can use the time period as the fixed effect, and the percentage foreign born as a independent variable, and the percentage of population just move into the track within 5 years as another independent variable. And the most important term is the interaction between these two independent variables. So this interaction is trying to see whether the fact that the population mobility, the movers are immigrants, moderate the bad effect of population turnover and result in crime. So I think the immigrant paradox in Chinatown can be tested through this regression. But I think this could probably form another project, but my course project just focus on the ethnicity, the population characteristics, why the population in Chicago's Chinatown is so different, and how it contributes to the uniqueness of the scenescapes, and altogether how the ethnicity and the scenescapes are slowing down the gentrification in Chicago's Chinatown, making it the only one Chinatown that is not being gentrified in the United States. Yeah, so that is my project.
Okay, very well presented. Questions, comments from anyone and all?
I have a comment, if that's okay. This presentation was I really enjoyed it. You did such a great job. I'm from Pasadena, outside of Los Angeles. I'm in the San Gabriel Valley, and we have a significantly, like most of my neighbors are Chinese immigrants, Taiwanese immigrants. We have a really large Asian American population here. And it's interesting because, and it's more of a comment, but when people want to go for hot pot or dim sum or want, people don't generally, like from my experience, don't really go to our Chinatown, and instead go to their suburbs like 5 to 10 miles outside, like from downtown LA, like Arcadia, Alhambra, Roland Heights, San Gabriel, where there are like really kind of vibrant Asian American communities with really like wonderful restaurants. So just kind of, and I think a lot of that is because of gentrification, like you talked about. There isn't really a lot in LA's Chinatown right now, but most Asian American communities have like really developed in the suburbs where I live. And I think there are a lot of like hip and trendy restaurants, and they also expanded the Metro Gold Line that goes to Chinatown, and there's a new park. So I think there are a lot of explanations as to why Chinatown in the city of Los Angeles isn't nearly as vibrant as it once used to be. So I just thought I think it'd be interesting to look at like the San Gabriel Valley as well, if you were to look at like the Los Angeles Chinatown. So I'd share.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's very helpful. I've been reading about this theory of spatial assimilation, which refers to the upper middle class immigrants move to the white neighborhood on the suburbs. I think this has something to do with gentrification as well, because as I said, Chinatown, they act as ethnic growth machine. This is like the commercialization of the Chinese culture, but this is to present itself as other, to attract the white people, the population from other races, but also you say that people go to suburbs to eat hot pot and stuff, but the Chinatown is very self-sufficient. I think more than half of the customers are the Chinese people, are the students or second generation immigrants, first generation immigrants. They like go to Chinatown for grocery shopping and for food and for cultural activities. So this is the characteristic of it being the home to the Chinese people. So that's why it is so self-sufficient. Yeah.
You other questions, comments from any other students who are here?
So what is the reason you have analyzed for Chicago Chinatown residents' fear of crime compared to Chinatown in LA and Boston? Is it mainly demographic, or is it culturally situated in Chicago, because Chicago has this history of gangster.
Yeah, because I like initially I want to form a project because I am doing my thesis on the crime in the neighborhoods in Chicago, but not focusing on Chinatown. But the documentary that I've been doing a lot of interviews with the residents in Chinatown. And whenever I ask them about like, how do you think Chinatown, Chicago can improve, or what do you hate most about the Chinatown in Chicago, they always say that the crime, like the high crime rates, that the Asian people are being attacked, being robbed or killed, and stuff like that. So I was thinking that this community, for years, they're struggling with the fear of crime, and they're putting efforts into building a community, creating scenescapes that can give people a sense of like a perception of safe. Just like you can see the courtyard style architecture and those public facilities like the public library. I think they are all built on the demand of the Chinese population in Chinatown to fight against the street gangs or crime.
You've raised lots of, well, any other questions before I talk from any other students or participants?
Oh, and can I say one more word about, when I analyze the visual symbols, like the heritage of the scenescape, I also read Professor Clark's paper on the heritage as a scenescapes. Yeah, and I think I will write more about the heritage in the Chinatown using the scenescape perspective. I think the heritage is also important in building this unique community and in fighting against gentrification. And it's an important reason why the Chinatown in Chicago is not being gentrified.
I have a quick question. Thanks for the presentation. It was really well done, I think. I was really also intrigued. You were introducing the scenes of the Chinatown as a whole, the plaza, the pagoda, as well as the courtyards. And I think it's quite unique as sort of the Chinatowns I've been to. Like this, Chicago's is sort of more as a coherent whole, especially as you mentioned, sort of the newer part of Chinatown, the courthouse sort of style, the more coherent art style. So I was wondering, when did this sort of redevelopment take place, and sort of what was the sort of leaders or sort of the initiative? Was it the Chinatown community, or is it the Chicago city government? Or so I mean, it looks like part of a placemaking project, and it's very successful. And also sort of, has that sort of not been going on more recently? Because you showed how this is not as sort of bohemian or edgy as some of the places in LA and other places. Yeah, those are some of my questions.
Yeah, for the first question, the redevelopment of Chicago's Chinatown was, I think it started in the early 1990s. That is when the process of gentrification has begun to emerge in most big American cities. But at that time, the city of Chicago and I think there is a community, there's a department that specifically focus on the the urban planning, the development of Chinatown, and they're like together with the Chicago's government and with the community in Chicago's Chinatown, they began to redevelop the area of Chinatown and build this new square in the early 1990s. And I'm sorry, I forgot your second question is about the Bohemian art.
Whoops. Can you hear me or?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yes.
okay. Yeah. So the second part was so not as much of that effort has been made in recent years, I would assume, right? Because there's not as much of a bohemian sense as you said, as compared to say Los Angeles. So I guess there's a gap in that sort of. There's not sort of a follow up to that effort because these look to be very well done sort of at the time. So there's this gap that I just recognized, and I was wondering if you had any.
Yeah, I think this is caused by the, as I said, the population, the ethnicity, because you can see the comparison between Chinatown and LA. Like they're mostly, I didn't show the socioeconomic status, but the people in Chicago's Chinatown are mostly working class. Like still 80% of them are working class people. They have relatively lower income and lower education, and even the age, you can see the median age in Chicago's China is 47, while in LA it is only 36 years old. So I would say that it is not that the Chinatown community doesn't want to make an effort to develop the bohemian art scene. It is because of the population composition. It is because they're mostly like very old immigrants, people from mainland who are not that and working class, not that very educated urban elites like in Los Angeles and New York. So the bohemian art scene didn't really develop, and so it makes the Chinatown in Chicago not that edgy and avant-garde compared to LA and New York. Yeah.
No, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
I also I had a question about, so you talked a little bit about how like some of the increases or like the changes in Chinatown was to attract like a new population of people, and also to like target like the white demographic, right? I was wondering if when you were interviewing the workers or like the people in Chinatown, what their perception was for this. Like, are they happy that Chinatown is like developing to be more like applicable? Or like the reason I ask is because from personal experience, I'm a second generation Chinese. So I was born here, but I also know how to speak Chinese. And then sometimes if I will go to like a Chinese restaurant, if I go from speaking like English to Chinese, they'll treat me better. Like it's happened a few times, and it's obviously like not every single time, but it's just something that I've noticed, especially because people usually just assume that I'm American, because like I am. But yeah, I was wondering about what the perception was for these workers.
Yeah, I wish I can show you the some clips in the documentary, but it's like a bit too long. It's 20 minutes, so I will describe in words. Like when I interviewed I interviewed like a restaurant owner, people who run a Chinese newspaper, and the young girl, like waitress who migrated here like not long ago, and they're both they were both born in China, and they think that in most Chinatowns in the US, the food and the culture and everything is so inauthentic. Like it's actually not China. It's fake. It's all targeted at the white population, and it presents itself as a kind of a Disneyland to like a human zoo. Some of my interviewees even say, yeah, just to attract tourists to generate revenues. But there are a lot of northern restaurants in Chinatown that I interviewed. They say that they are authentic. They target at the Chinese population, like not even the American-born Chinese, but the Chinese immigrants, that they provide authentic food and and some authentic representation and culture and stuff in Chinatown.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Other comments, questions? Okay, let me run through, and I would say don't feel you have to answer these now. I'd be happy if you'd think about them maybe and either put a note in maybe in the back of the end of the paper or whatever. But if you stay with your numbers there, look at the age of the men versus the women in Chinatown. That is, the women are older, the men are younger. There's a huge gender disparity in the age. So does that, one, two, if people in Chicago, Chinatown have largely come from the mainland, why did they choose to come to Chicago? And when did this difference emerge? Is this recent or does this go back through the whole 20th century? I mean, the big events which people talked about, say for San Francisco, was the building of the railroads, and which that brought the Chinese workers to the US. But more recently, the big event that at least was discussed at the time in the 1990s for the rationale for the creation of the new Chinatown that you featured, there are really architecturally two different Chinatowns. And the new one in the 1990s, people said, was because the English were leaving Hong Kong. The Chinese from the Hong Kong area felt they did not want to have all of their eggs only in Hong Kong. And so they transferred lots of funding and built that new area of Chinatown. At the same time, the same thing happened in Vancouver. So it's especially Chicago and Vancouver. I thought LA to some degree, but I don't know. But that this was related not just to local Chicago, but to international that is the relation between China, the Hong Kong becoming more part of China rather than part of Great Britain. And so the 1990s would be the date for that change. But even if that happened, the fascinating question you raised was, why did Chicago get defined or remain less bohemian than, say, LA or other locations? And I don't know, but one answer is it may be that ethnicity was more legitimate, salient, both for long-term residents and for the tourist industry, that Chinatown could attract people from McCormick Place conferences and the like, and who would love to have a meal in Chinatown, as they do in New York or LA. But it may be that the greater visible cultural salience of ethnic groups in Chicago compared to the rest of the country heightened the salience of Chinatown and reduced the development of mixed residents, more non-Chinese residents both in Chinatown or in suburbs, or the development of Chinatowns in suburbs to the degree which that happened in, say, in LA. So one quick answer is maybe that Chinatown more ethnic because Chicago is more ethnic, and that was in turn heightened by the Catholicism, the greater Catholicism of Chicago compared to especially New York and LA, which have more of a Jewish and Protestant dominant style. In Chicago, the dominant style is Catholic, not Protestant or Jewish, and that may be a factor heightening this tendency and suppressing the bohemianism in Chicago in general compared to LA and New York. But these are hypotheses. There's a debate going on between the so-called Chicago school, the LA school, and the New York school of urbanism. And it deals with some of these issues more generally, the salience and the legitimacy of ethnicity and Catholicism in Chicago, whereas these are far less stressed by interpreters, both in LA and New York. And there are multiple. Well, there's a book edited. I think it's on the reading list of the fall course called Urban Policy Analysis. The editor is Dennis, or the editors are Dennis Judd and Michael Dick Simpson at UIC, and it's University of Minnesota Press. Simpson, not A. Dick Simpson. Yeah, he's a political scientist. And Dennis Judd. The fear of crime simile may relate, and here I draw on the book by Richard Taub. Richard Taub surveyed citizens in 4 or 5 neighborhoods around Chicago and asked them how fearful are you of crime, or how bad is crime as a problem in your neighborhood? And the neighborhood that stood out the most was Hyde Park. That Hyde Parkers say we live in a very, very dangerous neighborhood. And then he compares the crime rates with those neighborhoods, and they're in fact not very different at all. So the biggest disparity, and so why should that be? And it looks as two of the most obvious factors seem to be: one, there are many people from outside Chicago who are living in Hyde Park, and maybe and who are students and new faculty or visitors. And the students are only there more briefly. And second, related to that, if I can quote, say, Seymour Martin Lipset, he was here for a talk at one point, and he said, without much effort, you could become the leading Black university in the United States. That is, the image that we in Hyde Park are in the middle of an African-American city, or a neighborhood at least, is shared with Chinatown. So that part of the image of high crime is associated with the large numbers of African Americans in surrounding neighborhoods. And so if there are many Black people nearby and you drive through those getting to Chinatown or getting to Hyde Park, then you think, oh, it must be dangerous to live in Hyde Park. Whereas in fact, as you point out, the Chinatown crime rate is actually lower, and that's the same thing, even more so perhaps in Hyde Park. So I'd say if you're doing a thesis on crime, I would distinguish maybe 3, 4, 5 different dimensions of crime. What is reported that is the event. So one is the event, such as a husband stabs a wife. Second, whether or not it's reported. If it's a baby knife, or it's only a bump on the shoulders, it may not be reported at all. So second is crime is reported to the police. Third is the perception of how dangerous it is, and that could be the crime rate as, do you live in a neighborhood with a high crime rate? And so you can call that perception or fear of crime, such as Richard Taub studied. And then we may have both individual results and sort of neighborhood results, or let's say big neighborhood areas and smaller ones. So I live in Bronzeville. I've lived here my whole adult life. I bike all over the city, and I bike in. And when the police department about 10 or 15 years ago released data by very small areas for crimes, and the classic ecological maps show the crime rates by neighborhood in the community areas that were developed in the 1920s, Chicago sociologists. That leads to the perception, and there's been a lot of even regression analyses or comparisons in all the newspapers, which will say the crime rate in Bronzeville is high because this is the average crime rate for the neighborhood of Bronzeville. However, when the new crime data came out by small area, what it shows is that my street, King Drive, and around here is roughly the same crime rate as in Lincoln Park. It's very low. Yeah. And where are the crimes? The crimes are right next to the L stops. So the L stops where people get on and off the elevated railroads, that is very, very high crime. And that's true all across the south side of Chicago. That you look at the crime rates by concentration by street corner, and it's the L stops which also join many buses, bus stops, lots of people coming, going, in, out, carrying groceries, carrying new things they may have bought when they've been shopping, and that may be the object of theft, of burglary, or stealing those new things by people who want to rob the people who have new stuff, and they may then fight, and then maybe someone will be shot, in part because of so my point is, individual rates, block street rates are different from broader neighborhood rates and perceptions of neighborhoods. And so that perception is a major part of this whole process. And that in turn leads to the culture and the imagery, which the neighborhood can either encourage or discourage. And so the Chinatown efforts to rebuild itself in the new Chinatown, that is the old Chinatown building, which you just showed there very briefly, in the past, let's say 1930s, 1940s, had a reputation of having Chinese gangsters, of having Chinese crime centered there, of selling drugs, selling other things, which were it's on the left, the traditional building on the left-hand side with the roofs on the top. I mean, that's the classic old building, which there's still medical doctors there. There's physical therapy. There are Chinese traditional medicine doctors, etc. But it also was considered in the past a crime center. And so in that sense, and there was a lot of fear of Chinese crime in San Francisco in those earlier years. Plus, I'll just add in briefly, when I say we're having this debate between Chicago, LA, and New York, the classic archetypical analysis of this is in a movie called Chinatown, and it is minimally about Chinatown. There's a little bit about Chinatown, but it's an exotic neighborhood within the film. It is, however, considered the archetypical history of the city of Los Angeles. It's not only considered the history, it's considered the analysis within the school, within the LA school tradition, which should not be dominated by social science, but which should include films, newspapers, and should appeal to the average general citizen. And so this film called Chinatown really has, murder, and the hero is divided. The hero who built the city of LA is two characters, the good character and the bad character. And his daughter hides her child in Chinatown to try to be impersonal, but the point is, and the good action of the founder of the city of Los Angeles was that he was the engineer who brought water to LA. LA was just a desert, and it was the creation of water being piped in from the Colorado River, which made LA become a large city. And so the water engineer, was the founder of LA in that sense, and in the film. But it's filled with violence. It's filled with manipulation of home prices and land prices. It's filled with elements which are the core images of what the LA school folks, Michael Deere and others, have tried to celebrate as the background history of LA. So, and in terms of ethnicity, there's virtually no ethnicity in the narrow writings, at least of Michael Deere. He talks about those suburbs, which may be from students who I know who are, say, Korean or Chinese or Vietnamese, where you have distinctive cultures within the LA County suburbs. They are treated as simply fragmented, not even the concept of ethnicity is not mentioned by the LA school theorists. They see these as that culture is minimally used by the LA school, whereas culture is a central analytical focus of the Chicago school, growing out of the ethnic cultures which have been central politically and socially, heightened by Roman Catholicism and the Irish leadership. But the Irish had a style of delegating specific leadership to individual wards and precincts and permitting the use of local languages and ethnic pride, featured by parades, by celebrations in holidays and the like, to go on. Street festivals, summer festivals, there's something like 3 times as many of these in Chicago as there are in New York and LA. And they have an ethnic foundation, but they've been celebrated and continued through the whole 20th century by the Chicago political leadership. And so it continues on today with tourism heightening it as well. Okay, so those are my overview comments. Some are loose commentaries, some are questions that I don't know the answers to, but I'm fascinated by what you showed us. You've sparked new questions. Even though I've been, reading and thinking about this for decades, you've brought some new insights and new data, and your videos are wonderful. So congratulations on all of that. And you've not only done the videos, which is where you were when you started the course, you brought in statistical data. You're talking about doing a regression for your other analysis and more. So, and the writing is also there as well. So, cheers, congratulations. It's a wonderful achievement, and you should be very proud.
Thank you so much. And thank you for your comments. They're really helpful. And I'm going to finalize writing up my paper.
Good. Yeah, I'm if you can at least hint at some possible answers or think about them, even if you can't answer them, at least leaving them as questions is good to do.
Yeah, sure.
And I'm delighted, and I hope we'll have a good integrated video from Alan, and that we can, with your permission, we can show this to others in the future.
Of course, I would be really happy to.
Excellent. Excellent.
Documentary. Yeah.
Okay. Any last comments from anyone else? All right. Well, let's. Alan, are you still there? Yeah. Do we have anything to discuss with for office hours with anyone else, or with us in your TA role? So I should ask, I guess, students. Are any of the students staying here for office hours and anything else you want to raise individually, or are you here for the Chinatown show?
Good, for the Chinatown show.
It was a show. But if the two of you don't know that film called Chinatown, you must see it. It's a brilliant film. And it's a rival. Sorry.
Is it directed by Polanski?
Yes. Yes. So he too was and is a very controversial director in his personal life, and that those themes show in the film. And he left the United States. They tried to get him to come back for trial. He refused. He lived in France. He lived in Poland, etc. So, but it was about near a few years after Bonnie and Clyde. So it was part of the 1968 revolution in counterculture to in that sense that that bad is good and good is bad, to try to say LA is worse, even worse than Chicago, and Chicago's a bad place, but we're worse in LA. And so that's part of what the LA School is about. And the film tries to do that. Tony, Reed, Zhang, Bisham, do you have anything as names who are still on our system, or have you hung up on us?
No, I don't have any more questions. Just for the presentation.
Okay, so you do not have questions?
No, I don't. I'm just here to hear the presentation.
Okay. Well, now thank you for your comments, and thank you for all that you are doing. And I look forward to keep on working with you with Kiji. Reed Liu, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have anything else you wanted to talk about?
I don't. I just asking Xiaoyu, is it possible to watch your film?
Yeah, of course.
Please?
Yeah.
It's really, really good.
Thank you. I can send the link to you via email. Oh, I can actually just
copy and paste Google Drive.
Paste it here, and you can paste it on Canvas. These are all fine.
Yeah, I'd be really interested to watch that as well.
Now, let me add one more quick point to add to this, to stir into the mix. This woman reminds me that I have heard that the Chinese Association in Chinatown, located there, is one of the foremost sophisticated, culturally aware ethnic organizations in all of Chicago. And they are serving now and increasing. The majority of the people they serve are not Chinese. They are Mexicans and African Americans, and they put on courses. They teach them how to use computers. They help them with childcare, with all kinds of things. And so the same thing is true of the Koreans, that the Korean Association is mostly serving Mexicans and African Americans. And the staffs of these organizations include many staff who are not Chinese or Korean. They include Mexicans and African Americans on the staffs of their organizations, which was a small revolution. So the transition within these, in a sense, may not be gentrification, but it may be an opening and an ethnic, I won't try to apply a label. I mean, there are multiple labels that could be considered, such as diversification, or maybe or maybe not assimilation, or hybridization. These are all terms that are used and that have different, potentially conflicting meanings, say in Chicago, New York, and LA, and for different, even those are too general. That is, different individuals, as you described. Some of them talk about this as being done for tourists. Others will say, no, it's being done for, it is authentic. It is serving the local Chinese who live here. And that is often used as a Chicago defining, authentic labeling of ethnicity in Chicago, that these ethnic restaurants and experiences are not done for tourists. They're done because people locally want to do them and enjoy them. You may not live in Chinatown. You may live in a suburb, or if you're Korean, you may go back to a Koreatown kind of restaurant on once a week or once a month or whatever, or a Korean church. But it nevertheless can be part of your ethnic identity, which is celebrated through some of these institutional mechanisms, which are still there. So each of these are different conceptions of changes in ethnicity and assimilation. And when you get to second, third, fourth generations, these become more and more complicated and have different meanings, as has been written about by many students in my classes who are my main sources of a lot of stuff like this. So thank you for adding more.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Okay. Alan, do you and